Welcome. This is a wonderful opportunity to both hear about and discuss multiple ways of knowing in conservation and ecology. My name is Taylor White. I'm on the SCBNA Society for Conservation Biology North America student subcommittee and am a PhD candidate in ecology and evolutionary biology at University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Awaswas speaking Yupi tribe within the Ama Mutsun tribal band, which is comprised of descendants of indigenous people taken to Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista missions during the Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, and who today are working very hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historic trauma. I'd also like to acknowledge that I spent most of my life and time learning and researching on Tlingit Ani. Ani is the Tlingit word for land, and I would just like to say Gunish Chish to Tlingit people for their excellent stewardship of that special place since time immemorial. Gosh, okay, I am truly humbled by the amount of knowledge in this room, but I have one quick housekeeping thing. If you want to sort of learn more about this platform that is coming to you or become a member of the Society of Conservation Biology, you can do that. And you can do that at this website here. You can also check out more North America section news and check out the recording for this webinar. So this webinar is recorded. We've had previous webinars that have been recorded in the past as well. So if you're interested, you can check out non-traditional careers in academia, science and at Conservation Frontiers, and this one. So great, we've got an upcoming one as well, the Equity and Inclusion in Conservation Research, and you can sign up for that on the website. And if you're interested in joining the student subcommittee, please contact Melissa Cronin. So without further ado, I would like to just share our panelists for this talk today. We have talking Dr. Lynn Lee, marine ecologist, and Niisii Guujaaw, the resource conservation biologist at Gwaii Haanas National Marine Conservation Area Reserve and Haida Heritage Site. Then we'll have Dr. Sonia Ibarra, a recent grad of the PhD program at UAF College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, and coordinator of the new Tamamta Program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So hopefully she can share a little bit more about that. Last but not least, Dr. Andrea Reid, assistant professor and PI at the University of British Columbia's Institute for Ocean and Fisheries. She's also helping to lead and launch the Center for Indigenous Fisheries. And if anyone has questions, please do feel free to post them up in the chat. We will be paying attention to the chat, and we'll be taking those questions at the end of these presentations. So without further ado, Lynn and Niisii, please, I will unshare.
Thank you. I'll try and share and hope the tech works. Okay. Share. And let's see. So if I play, do you see the whole screen? Yes? Okay, perfect. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of the side there. How do I move people? Oh, there we go. Okay, so hi, thank you so much for the introduction, Taylor. I'm going to see if my video is okay, as long as you guys can hear me. So I just wanted to give you a little background. So I'm the marine ecologist at the Gwaii Haanas National Park Reserve, National Marine Conservation Area Reserve, and Haida Heritage Site right now, but I have had many hats here on Haida Gwaii, and so this is where I live. So Haida Gwaii is an archipelago of islands off the mainland of northern British Columbia, just south of those of you in Southeast Alaska. And I live in Tallel, which is up here on the East Coast where that pink star is. And that's me and my partner on the beach. And I'm your talking head today, but really I'm representing the work of so many people that are working together here to take care of Haida Gwaii. And I'd like to especially acknowledge Russ and Russ, who and the AMB, who have all provided much leadership for the projects that I'm going to talk to you about. And so this is really about different ways that we have worked together as settler and Haida communities and people on Haida Gwaii in various marine conservation initiatives and land conservation initiatives. And so a little background about me is that I actually had nothing to do with the ocean until I went to university. So I grew up in the middle of Canada in Winnipeg and in Calgary. And then I moved to Vancouver to go to school for marine biology because that's what I wanted to do. Because they make so much money. And so I ended up here on Haida Gwaii after I met my spouse in university. So here is Skidegate, and that's where the office is for Gwaii Haanas. And I made this terrible line on the map to show you that Gwaii Haanas is the lower third of the archipelago. And so you can see that below the yellow line. And the other little snippet about me, I have been here since 1993, so my job here with Gwaii Haanas is relatively recent in the last 6 years. And in the time that I've been on island, I've worn many hats to do with marine conservation and land conservation, and worked within the Haida Nation and with the Haida Nation as a partner, working both as their marine and shellfish biologist for many years, doing dive surveys around Haida Gwaii, and then also working with them in marine planning, and starting the initial work that that some of this foundational work is built on. So with that, one more thing is that because of spending all this time underwater, I'm also a bit of a closet artist. So lots of things in the marine world inspire my art. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a few stories and talk about some lessons that I've learned from working together with all the wonderful people here. This is first about Gwaii Haanas, and so this is the legacy pole and the first pole to be raised in Gwaii Haanas in over 100 years, and it was a collaborative effort between all of Gwaii Haanas management partners. And these partners, we have a special ability to work together here. So the first context, I guess, is to think about building and maintaining solid foundations for working together. And so in this case, for the management of Gwaii Haanas, we have a foundation of the Archipelago Management Board, which has 3 folks from the Haida Nation, 2 from Parks Canada, and 1 from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so these folks make the management decisions around what happens in Gwaii Haanas. And so that provides already this co-management foundation. And because of that, Haida ethics and values sort of represent their worldview around how the world works and how people should treat each other. And so these 6 foundational ethics and values: respect, balance, interconnectedness, giving and receiving, responsibility, and seeking wise counsel are all part of marine planning, land planning, and taking care of the islands. And these were brought into the recent Gwaii Haanas Land Sea People Management Plan, which integrates management of people, the land, and the ocean together. And so it's the first of its kind for Parks Canada. And that was just signed off in November of 2018. And so from the 25 years of working together, the AMB has these sort of take-home messages that I think apply to all of you doing research with Indigenous communities as well. So taking time to build trust, prioritizing culture, finding common ground, engaging together, and seeing partnership and cooperative governance as an opportunity. So it's not to say that any of this is easy. There's a lot of hard work involved and a lot of back and forth involved, but in the end, it ends up being something far richer than working alone. So in what I focus this, there's a lot of slides I'm going to go through quickly because I want to finish in 10 minutes for Niisii to continue. So we can always come back to the details, and I'm just going to highlight the main points in the slides. So the story here is that we all need to recognize, I think there is this knowledge bias and power dynamic difference that exists. And I'm using this salmon or creatures of the forest as an example because that's something that people that have lived on the land have known for millennia. And science took it more seriously when scientific research came out about how the nitrogen isotopes from the ocean were ending up in the trees in the forest. And so it's just an example, and not to, it's not saying anything's right or wrong, but just understanding and acknowledging that we have these biases in whether we accept a piece of information as truth or as reality or how the world works partly depends on how it comes to us. And if we're more inclined to believe the scientific Western science knowledge, then we dismiss millennia of knowledge that is equally valid. And so finding ways of reconciling that and coming to terms with those differences in bias and power. So this traditional knowledge, and I'm not going to read through this, but the key messages are that it's integrative, it's intergenerational, handed down from generation to generation, of the relationships between people living in their environment and their relationships with the people in the place there. So it's not just about ecology, it's not just about species and habitats, but it's about the relationship of people and those places. And so the Haida Nation, under leadership of Russ Jones, embarked on this Haida Marine Traditional Knowledge study, and that took 3 years. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it may be that other coastal communities that you're working with already have a knowledge base that's been documented in a way that you can work with communities to build on, or it may be that you want to talk to communities about how to add more knowledge to that based on your common interests. But all this to say that it's a lot of work and a lot of hours and capacity and time that needs to be invested in really doing this right. And so in this case, this was a 3-year study led by and for the Haida Nation, with many participants from all the communities and lots of hours of recordings that were then meticulously transcribed, and maps that were also transcribed into GIS systems. So here's an example, and what this allows them to do is the nations can then bring the traditional knowledge to the table on their own terms. And in the case of the traditional knowledge study, it's been brought into many marine planning processes and some research projects and outreach and education. So, and this knowledge, importantly, is held by the Haida Nation. So it belongs to them, and they are the curators and the folks who share products like this one, the Ocean and Way of Life map, that depicts different ways of knowing based on that knowledge database from interviews. And here's another depiction of Haida Seasonal Round, which shows how the people are connected through the seasons with the ecology and hunting and fishing activities and traditional practices. So third is to acknowledge and address diverse priorities. So learning to listen, to share, and to hear one another. And this case study is around Inang herring, which is a ecological keystone species as well as a cultural keystone species. So it's important for all of these reasons for people, as well as all the reasons that we know for forage fish. And I'll leave you to read most of this, but the highlight is that because of the relationship with the Haida Nation, Parks Canada, and Fisheries, we have these technical working groups where all 3 organizations have technical representatives that work together in a very collaborative way. And in this particular group, we were able to bring in traditional knowledge because the Haida, and represented by Russ, would bring in the work that they had done and talk about the different spatial dynamics, for example, where we're currently managing in a large spatial scale, a large area, and splitting that up into these smaller areas that Haida know the herring to come back to. And so being able to then incorporate that into the modeling work that's done in fisheries and oceans to come up with modeling that is more reflective of other knowledge. And as part of that work, we also had these additional semi-structured interviews that were co-conducted with the Haida Nation. So Dan McNeil was the representative, sorry, I'm losing my voice. And these collaborative interviews then were used to quantify alternative metrics for management strategy evaluation. So just another example of how the engagement of the Haida Nation in the work itself and in the analyses led to a different outcome than just, for example, taking traditional knowledge outside the context of the people who own the knowledge. And then that's also taken into collaborative governance and looking at more knowledge co-production and issues of community access and considering things that otherwise may not be taken as priority objectives in these governance processes. So the fourth is to understand traditional use and stewardship by building relationships with people in place. So an example from my PhD work, and every community will have different protocols in place, but basically respectful research protocols as examples of how I worked with the Heiltsuk Nation was done in collaboration with them, where we developed the research proposals and the documents related to consent, the interview questions, and these were all approved the nation we used. And we conducted them with someone from the community. The nation itself determined who we should interview. And then at the end of the process, the interview data belong to the nation. And so then the results and the reports that are generated from that data are reviewed and approved by the nation before they're shared, and in this case, before publication. And of course, there are co-authorship considerations for the people that were really intimately involved in that work. And so just to give you an example of the integration of data, I'm not sure how long have I gone, because I'll go quickly if someone can tell me. I can't see anything. So
Yeah, you might have to switch to Niisii here soon. But
okay,
very
okay, I'll do really quickly. So these are just examples of how there was quantitative data and qualitative data both used, and how the qualitative data gave you information about why people think things changed, and not just a number of how many abalone there were there, and also these cultural connections. So I took my granddaughter out there with me one day and showed her abalone, and she said, you can eat these. And so it's the younger generation that are losing because they don't have that connection with these species and places. And then also signs of recovery that are being seen by people who are out on the land. And so then we could take that with scientific field studies and look at what each knowledge source and the strengths and differences between them were in terms of the story they told, to get a bigger picture. Building knowledge and trust together. This is a project Niisii is involved in called Chihu Til Innistel, Nurturing Seafood to Grow in Gwaii, Haanas. We have many partners and work together in the field. So we're sharing knowledge while we're working together and integrating traditional values into the research and management. And finally, work with people who genuinely want to make it work, because it's messy. So we have to learn from our mistakes, because we will make them, and don't sweat the small stuff. And this is from the Haida Gwaii project, or it's Haida Gwaii Steve. I've totally messed up. There's a Haida name, Haida Gwaii Gui, I believe, and Cindy Boyko, who's on the Archipelago Management Board as well as on our project team. She said this best for models, there won't be a one size fits all. And so that's the same with this sort of work, working with communities in a way that works for them and for the researchers, and building that relationship is really what's key. And in this big project, we have about 45 collaborators. It's co-led with the Haida Nation. And because we have this common goal of working together to address the expected ecosystem level effects of sea otters and climate change, there's something that we're working towards, and having these many perspectives fosters an innovative approach. So to close, multiple ways of knowing give us a richer perspective. It leads to many different, we're not integrating knowledge in the sense of collapsing one into another, but looking at everything and what it tells us to get this richer picture of how things might work. And the challenge for us moving forward, and we can come back to this in discussion, is how should we respectfully integrate knowledge from different systems moving into the future? And so I won't read this, it's a quote from a review from an indigenous scholar, which I think points at the crux of the challenge that faces us moving into the future. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Okay. I found this putting together this presentation really difficult because I feel like I've spent most of my life thinking about this topic, and it's hard to pick out which parts to share. So instead of a PowerPoint, because Lynn's shared a lot of the work that I work with her on, I've just put some pictures together, and I'm just going to introduce myself and a bit of context where I come first, because I think that's an important part of these different ways of knowing. So my name is Niisii. I was born and raised on Haida Gwaii. I'm of the Ch'ath Eagle clan, and my grandmother is Gwagana. My father is Chief Gadamsta of the Gogils Kigawai Raven clan. My name Niisii comes from a little island in my clan's territory. And I have this picture up because it has, I'm holding a red Irish Lord sculpin, and I have that tattooed on my arm traditionally because it's one of my crests. So that's a traditional stick and poke tattoo. And then sculpin idea is one of my, like the first scientific field skill I learned. So having that picture, I think, is a good representation of both ways of knowing. I have this picture up because it's a picture of my dad and his kids and his grandchildren in his great-grandmother's house pit in the village that his family comes from. So this is kind of a side note, but I think it's really important to understand the context. So when our population went down from about 10,000 to 600 is an estimate. We lived in many different villages, and then we all moved, or our people all moved into these two focal villages that we live in today. But my dad's great-grandmother grew up in this exact house pit, or this house. This is the remains of it. And he knew her, he lived with her when he was a little kid. So I include that because I think it's an important visual, and it really shows that we're not that far away from our old ways of knowing. And that's really just a few generations where he knew someone that grew up in a longhouse. And this is just another picture showing when we used to have potlatches. We can't anymore, but this is my dad's chieftainship and us dancing at a big house in Bella Bella. So we grow up on the land and waters in Haida Gwaii, as all Haida Gwaii kids do. We learn about food harvesting, and food harvesting it's not just like a cultural or like superficial fun thing we do, but it's really like integral to our life here. And when we grow up food harvesting, we're learning about the environment, we're learning about all the ecological interactions, how much to take, what to look after, which places to go, how to take enough that we can make sure that those populations stay. So this is my niece and my sister about 10 years ago picking seaweed, and me as a teenager learning how to process fish. So yeah, and that connection, that makes us so connected to our food, but also to our land and our waters. And from a young age, like you can see my little niece here, she knows what she's doing and she knows the importance of it. And she's learning to share with elders when we get back, and she's learning how to look after that. So we've been going to the same seaweed beds her whole life. So now she knows, and she sees change over time. And she knows how to look after that area. There's my nephew fishing also. So again, just I'm just sharing these because it's such an important part of our life, and that it's really food security. And there's so many Indigenous issues that are studied and in the news, but they all really relate down to food security. It's Indigenous communities' ability to continue this way of life and this food system. Oops, sorry. So yeah, it's really like most of our protein over the winter comes from our fish still. And that might be an obvious thing, but it's an important part of that studying these marine systems. Really, it's really also our lifeline, and in communities where there's so much diabetes and we're isolated, it's really a staple to our communities. And here are my grandparents processing fish. Another part of growing up in our community is language and kind of like the education we get our whole lives. So this is my nanai, my grandmother, that teaches me Haida, and now we're learning on Zoom because of COVID. But we learn so much from the language. And sorry, I didn't mean to have a presentation that's just full of pictures of myself, but there's a point to it. So we learn, like we learn names for seafood, and we learn there might be 15 words for octopus where there's only one in English, and that's because we're learning all the different parts of the octopus that we use for different things, or place names that are really descriptive and teach us a lot about our place. So there's another. And then not only harvesting from the marine environment, but we harvest from the terrestrial environment too. And here's a picture of my sister with a cedar bark stripping, and then in Gwaii Haanas where I work, an old test block for a cedar. They test if they can chop it down for a monumental carving. So yeah, it's really important to me to be able to still do those things and then see places where I'm lucky enough to work in a place where I can see where our ancestors did it too. And more harvesting pics of my nephew. So when I was in grade 12 was the year that the Enriched Northern Gateway pipeline was proposed, and that would bring tankers through the waters in Haida Gwaii. And that was kind of the same months that we were all deciding what we were going to do for post-secondary. And many people in our communities, both Haida and non-Haida, provided testimony at the hearings for this pipeline. So yeah, that's 17-year-old me and my little sister. And that whole process was so emotional for us. And so like it was such a tragedy because we knew that it was probably going to be approved anyways, but so many people put their whole heart and soul into this testimony because it was, we were just trying everything we could. And the point of talking about this is that's why I decided that I needed to, I knew what was true in the Haida way of knowing that I have grown up in, but that I had always been interested in marine, and that I needed to be able to have a foot in both worlds and speak their language too, so they could understand on their table, I guess, and in research that's valued in the Western world. So to be able to have foot in both worlds for things like this, protecting our home and our food systems. So I went to school and I studied marine biology and Indigenous studies. And at first it felt like it was like two opposing degrees, kind of two separate degrees. And then near the end, I was able to do have some self-designed courses, and there was a few courses that really combined the courses there. And I did a field school through UVic where I was able to kind of bridge those. And I think that was really, it was valuable for me to do both and then bring it home. I plan to do my master's one day, but I have made a goal for myself that I have to learn the language first because it's endangered. Sorry, I think I'm about at time, but now Lynn talked about our projects at work. So I work for Gwaii Haanas on Lynn's team. We get to do really cool field work, but we also get to do these community things. Like here we are sharing sea urchin that we've from our culling project, and we're sharing it with elders in the community, which is really rewarding and a really nice way of connecting them to the scientific projects. We can feed them their traditional food that's really a treat for them these days, and then talk to them about our project. And it's been really important for me to be able to like hold my work accountable to my community, and be able to do that, be able to pay it back, but also find ways to make sure that the work we're doing and the research we're doing is accessible and understandable, and people can see that it's benefiting and it's not just for research. So growing up, we've seen all of our elders always be they're always participating in, or all of our knowledge holders in different research projects and being interviewed. And so it's interesting to enter research and then see how we can change that, and how the system, like, they don't really match up. And so last year I worked on helping with some abalone interviews with some elders. So here's a picture of me with my uncle after our interview. And I learned a lot in that process. We were helping some of Natalie, I think Natalie's on here, Natalie Band's PhD students do traditional knowledge study interviews with elders. And I learned a lot from that process because I came in just kind of as a bridge because I had relationships with these elders, but I didn't want to be in a position where we were exploiting our personal connections with these elders. So there was 3 of us Haida biologists that were working on this. And I learned a lot about like interview fatigue. If these people have been asked the same questions for decades, they don't want to keep answering the same questions, like what resources are important to you. And they distrust the system. That the system hasn't always worked in their favor. They've previously, like, people have shared the most fruitful areas that they harvested something, and then DFO policy turns that kind of against us. So people are really distrusting of sharing specifics. And yeah, there's just so much I learned from that process of like, oh, what can we actually ask our people, and what's not appropriate, and what can we expect them to give us. So now we're working on this sea otter project, and we're trying really hard. A big part of the project in creating this ecosystem model is the community engagement, and we're trying really hard to approach it. Me and my colleague Ecologists, who also grew up here and is Haida and also a biologist, we're working together to make sure that it's really coming from a place where it's shaped around what the community means, instead of this traditional knowledge layer being kind of added after the Western science has determined the whole process. And that TK and different ways of knowing has become so popular, but it's so often just added as like an extra layer at the end without really designing your like the research project is already designed, and then the TEK is kind of put on top, and it's really difficult to do it without doing it that way, I think. But it's really important to put in the effort, and to have the academic Western research side of things be flexible and be able to totally change route if that's what the other way of knowing tells you to do. Sorry, I think that I've gone way over.
Thanks, Niisii. No, that was really wonderful. I think we can talk more at the end. We will probably go into questions a little bit, but I want to let Sonia start her talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? Okay. Buenas tardes. Thank you, Niisii, for your presentation. Mi nombre es Sonia Ibarra. Good afternoon. My name is Sonia Ibarra. And today I'm going to be sharing my PhD research that I just wrapped up this month about addressing a complex resource conflict, sea otters and shellfish in Southeast Alaska. So I just want to take a moment and express my deepest and humblest gratitude to the Akwaan, the traditional territories of where I'm currently calling in from today in Juneau, Alaska. And I acknowledge their past and present future stewardship of these lands. I also want to acknowledge Kihuan, Hiniaquan, and Haanas Klaga. And these are the traditional territories of where the work, I work together with communities, and I'll talk about those communities in just a moment. So sea otters are voracious predators that can consume up to a quarter of their weight every day, and they're shellfish eaters. And this includes a variety of species like clams, urchins, Dungeness crab, a variety of species. And these are of commercial importance, but they're also important to subsistence and recreational harvesters as well. And this competition for shared shellfish resources has resulted in a complex resource conflict. And this conflict is also exacerbated by social and environmental inequities that exist. And social ecological systems is a concept that is very recent and can include weaving various knowledge systems and centers on adaptation and change. So for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on this social ecological dimension as well as management. And this is going to be also the outline for today's presentation. Oops. Okay. So the region of focus of my work is in Southeast Alaska, in the traditional territories of Kihuan and the Tlingit community of Cake, Hiniaquan and the Tlingit community of Kloak. Craig is an ethnically mixed community with Tlingit, Haida, and non-native residents, and Haanas Klaga and the Haida community of Heidelberg. And while there's different cultural groups that reside in these communities, what is a unifying theme is that access to subsistence foods is critical to the well-being of these communities. And I'm talking more than just nutrition. So from this point forward, I'm to stop using the word subsistence and focus on customary and traditional foods, as this is a concept that tribal leaders have recommended that I use instead of subsistence, because customary and traditional foods incorporate components of intergenerational knowledge and transmittance, just as shown in this picture here. Aspects of spirituality, be it the spirit of the animals, the water, the land, includes place-based knowledge and a complex sharing and distribution system. And so the focus of my work is to understand the relationship between sea otters, indigenous peoples, and shellfish by weaving indigenous, local, and Western knowledge systems. And I think when we think about weaving knowledge systems, it's important to recognize that there's various forms of experts and knowledge, and that there should be a complementary validation within a body of knowledge. And what I mean by that is that indigenous knowledge holders should be the ones that are helping create and document this knowledge and validating this knowledge within their culture and values, versus taking this knowledge and validating against another form of knowledge, such as Western knowledge systems. And by doing this, we begin to recognize and hopefully address power disparities that very clearly exist amongst various knowledge holders. And that there's aspects of relational accountability in this weaving, that we're not just accountable to the type of information or data that we collect, but we're accountable to the people that generate this knowledge. So I wanted to present a temporal representation of Indigenous and Western sea otter management, and this is not drawn to scale. And if it was, the little red and blue markers on the far right would not be visible. So Indigenous people have been in relationship with sea otters over thousands of years, and this is confirmed both by oral history accounts as well as archaeological research. And this is quite different than the decades of Western management that's a lot shorter in length and experience. And here I present an archaeological review of Indigenous sea otter human relationships and management. So from the Western Aleutian Islands to Southeast Alaska, Northern British Columbia, all the way to Channel Islands in California. So essentially throughout the range of sea otters, Indigenous people have been in relationship. And here I present some papers in the archaeological research that demonstrate that through this relationship, the Indigenous peoples have hunted sea otters that resulted in more abundant as well as large shellfish. So we're going to focus on the social dimension of this complex resource conflict first. And here I ask two questions. How are sea otters impacting customary and traditional foods? And which other factors are impacting these customary and traditional foods? So to begin this work, myself and Dr. Stephen Langdon met with the 4 tribes in each of these communities to introduce this idea, and also the methodology that we wanted to use, including semi-structured interviews, structured questionnaires, mapping exercises, site visits, and participant observer trips. And I won't go into the details of these methods, but I'll be happy to talk with anybody about this. But I just want to take a moment to focus on this picture, because it's not every day that we capture important moments in our lives. And this was one of the most important moments in my PhD, where we introduced the project, and there was a resounding concern for these mapping exercises, where our leaders expressed concern and shared that these technique had been done in the past in these same 4 communities, where resources were mapped, and then that information made publicly available. Commercial fisheries opened up for those resources in a way that did not benefit the community. So as a response to this concern, we agreed to never publish any of these maps or present any site-specific information. So you'll see that reflected here today. During these meetings, we also talked about identifying and compensating harvest experts. And when I say harvest experts, I'm specifically referring to customary and traditional harvesters, sea otter hunters, and elders. We also talked about hiring community members to help shape the research and compensating people for their time. So the first question, how are sea otters impacting customary and traditional foods? 100% of harvest experts said that as time went on and sea otter populations expanded, both in geographic scope and in number, that there were smaller and fewer shellfish at locations with sea otters. 100% of harvest experts also said that as time went on and sea otter populations expanded, that there was a decline in harvestable shellfish areas. over time. And again, this is just a cartoon to exemplify a point. It's not an actual harvest map. Then we asked which other factors are impacting these customary and traditional foods beyond sea otters. 73% of harvest experts attributed other factors. Abalone and red sea cucumber declines were attributed to commercial and charter fishing impacts, as well as, commercial fishing for these two resources, and then Dungeness crab by both commercial and charter fishing, in addition to sea otter impacts. So in summary, there were smaller and fewer shellfish at locations with sea otters. There was declines in shellfish availability as compared to the past, as well as other factors, and that harvest areas have contracted and shifted away from sea otters. Next, we focus on the ecological dimension, and I asked 2 questions. How do sea otters influence clam populations, and how do people influence clam populations? So the methods that we used for this dimension was to work with local harvest experts to select the sites that we sampled, hire community members from youth to adults to participate and help shape the research, and compensate them for their time and expertise. And we conducted intertidal clam and shell pit surveys in Heidelberg and Cake specifically for this dimension. And then we incorporated aspects of research reciprocity, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. So we focus specifically on butter clams because it's a common species. They're an important food for people and sea otters. They're not commercially harvested, so we can disentangle that effect. They're a candidate species for community monitoring because it doesn't require many tools other than buckets, shovels, and sifters. And so for the study design to do this work, this was informed by local harvest experts as well as the interviews that we conducted. And we sampled butter clams at beaches where humans harvest clams, beaches where humans harvest clams and sea otters are starting to show up and predate on those clams, so locations of interaction, beaches where sea otters eat clams, and beaches that's too far for people to go and sea otters haven't showed up yet. And so we laid a 100-meter transect parallel to the shoreline at the zero tide mark, and then we dug 10 random holes that were 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot in each of these sites. And then we took those contents and sifted them. We sorted those clams, and then we measured the width of these clams. And while we gather data for all clam species, here I focus on butter clams. We also wanted to measure sea otter activity at each of these sites. And so at the same site that we did the live clam survey, we laid a much shorter 50-meter transect at the same zero tide mark, and we collected all the shells on the surface on a 1 meter width of this. And then we took guidelines created by Kivitik et al. On what a sea otter cracked shell looks like, where a sea otter will characteristically break a clam shell, usually at the hinge, and leave one of the sides cracked and the other sides whole. And then we also counted the number of sea otter dug pits at each of these sites. So we developed an index of sea otter activity by adding the number of pits and the number of sea otter cracked shells and doing some transformations to the data to meet assumptions of our statistics. We wanted to also measure human activity at each of these sites. So we measured the distance to community to the clam survey site using paths that are typically traveled by harvesters. So for the first question, how does sea otters influence clam populations? Here's data from Heidelberg. So on the y-axis or vertical axis, we have clam size, and on the x-axis, we have sea otter activity, with low sea otter activity sites are in black, high sea otter activity sites are in red, and this dotted light line at 38 millimeters represents the minimum size of butter clam reproduction. So what we see in Heidelberg is that butter clam size decreases with increasing sea otter activity site. And I also want to note that at these high sea otter activity sites, that there's a large proportion of clams that are below the minimum size of reproduction, meaning that sea otter predation on clams at these sites may reduce the reproductive potential of butter clams at these locations. Next, how do people influence clams? So again, on the y-axis, we have butter clam size. On the x-axis, we have distance to community, with 0 referring to community center, 60 kilometers away from the community. So in Heidelberg, we see that butter clam size decreases with distance to community. And I also want to note that these highest sea otter activity sites are at least 20 or greater kilometers away from the community. And in Heidelberg in particular, there's a lot of localized hunting close to the community, resulting in these higher sea otter activity sites farther from the community. We ask these same questions in cake. How do sea otters influence clam populations? And what we see in cake is that cake butter clam size was variable with sea otter activity, and that we do see a declining trend in clam size at these highest sea otter activity sites. I also want to note that cake sea otters is a lot more recent than they are in Heidelberg. So it may take time for the observations that we see in Heidelberg to happen in cake. And then we asked, how do people influence clam populations in cake? And what we see in cake is that butter clam size decreased with increasing distance to community and high sea otter activity sites. So interaction was very important. And then I also want to note that these highest sea otter activity sites are in varying distance to the community. So they're a lot closer in cake than they are in Heidelberg. We also wanted to give to the community beyond data. So we harvested hundreds of pounds of customary and traditional foods that were then shared with community members, not just to give beyond data, but also to recognize the traditional territories of where our work was situated. So in summary, clams were smaller where there was more sea otter activity. Human harvest of sea otters may facilitate larger clams, and giving back to communities beyond data is a really important consideration as we think how we can decolonize the way that research is done. So next I focus lastly on this management dimension. And I asked two questions. What are current Indigenous management recommendations for restoring balance between people and sea otters? Actually, three questions. Are there barriers to current Indigenous management recommendations? And what are past Indigenous sea otter management strategies? So for the methodology used in this dimension, this is the same methodology that we use in the social dimension. So I won't go into any more detail beyond that. So for the first question, what are current Indigenous management recommendations for restoring balance between people and sea otters? 100% of our harvest experts said that there was a need to increase local sea otter hunting. And Anthony Christensen from Heidelberg says, well, the only thing that is going to deal with them is more hunting. You have to pick up the pressure. You have to figure out what an acceptable quarter is for them to manage themselves within, so that they are not impacting all of the resources across the entire region because they have that potential. 85% of harvest experts said that there's a need to focus hunting locally. And Lloyd Davis from Cake says, I'm hoping that there's some young guys that are going to want to fight for our grounds right here and to try to keep these sea otters out from right in front of town here. Next, I asked, are there barriers to these management recommendations? And there were 6 identified barriers. 88% of harvest experts said that fuel and or financial subsidies are needed for local sea otter hunting because of the high cost of harvesting, processing, and sewing hides. Establishing a local tannery that would help offset these costs as well. And then the need for legal changes to the MMPA that would allow the sale of whole sea otter pelts to non-native clients. For example, in order for an Alaska Native person to sell a sea otter product, it must be a significantly altered handicraft, such as the one worn here by Frank Hughes on the right. The need to develop a market for sea otter handicrafts, and lastly, addressing blood quantum, where sea otter hunters express concern that if their child intermarried with a non-native person, that their grandchild's blood quantum would not be high enough in order to be eligible to harvest, sew, or process sea otters because of the 1/4 Alaska Native blood quantum requirement. So lastly, what are past Indigenous sea otter management strategies? 10% of harvest experts talked about maintaining balance through sea otter hunting. And Deborah Head from Craig says, I want to share something that I've heard over the years, passed down by my elders, and it spoke really strong to me, and that's why I remember it. Canoeing in the boat, a young man going out to hunt, and he looks over and he says to the sea otter bobbing, he says, you better go to the outside waters or you're gonna end up a headman's headdress. Our people talked to them and they said, you better go to the outside. And that's how I heard it, and that's how it was. There was understanding between the Otter people and the people that inhabit an area, and they saw them and they talked to them. You better go to the outside waters or you're going to end up a headman's headdress. So our people were really, we went to war, and many people died because of boundary disputes. And all of our people were not just people. We had otter people, we had wolf people, eagle people, we had raven people, the spirit of all these creatures, the killer whale people. There was always an understanding between the people and the other people, and they held their boundaries. I believe we held our boundaries. We're not doing a really good job of that right now. So in summary, harvest experts talked about more local sea otter hunting, the creation and maintenance of local sea otter exclusion zones, and the need to address various barriers for local sea otter hunting to be successful. So in conclusion, I share with you that complex resource conflicts may benefit from a social ecological approach. Drastic shellfish reductions due to sea otters, as well as other factors, have had negative consequences for rural communities. And Indigenous communities are adapting and have been adapting for millennia. And that local people as local managers is an important consideration in terms of finding solutions that make local sense. So I wanted to share some reflections, some personal reflections for weaving knowledge systems. I think it's really important that as researchers, that we unpack colonial assumptions and methodologies, whether that be our educational training or what society has bestowed upon us. And this has been a really important process for myself as an Indigenous person from Mexico, is how do I not lose myself in this process, but also not carry some of the colonial and internalized oppression that I have. And not all knowledge is meant to be shared, and it's important. This is a really important idea. And some of it must be protected very carefully. And that it takes a great deal of time and trust to do this type of work. And that we must consider this anthropological concept of do no harm, where we carefully outweigh the consequences, not just of our work today, but the consequences of our work tomorrow. And with that, I just want to say muchísimas gracias, Hawa Gunishish, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. That was wonderful, beautiful work. And just Dr. Andrea Reid, I want to encourage you to take the full 20 minutes, and we'll just take what's left for questions. And if panelists feel comfortable to include any contact info in the chat, if any questions are unanswered, please feel free to share contact info and we can get those answered. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much. I feel really honored to be here among this great group of panelists. So neat. Amwilla Willina, hello, how are you? My name is Andrea Reid. I'm a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation and a descendant of the Gisgast or killer whale clan from the village of Gingolth on the BC-Alaska border. I was raised, however, on the east coast of Canada in Mi'kma'ki on Epikwit, or what is now known as Prince Edward Island, and I've been slowly working my way west my whole life. I did my Bachelor of Science and Master's degree in biology at McGill University in Montreal, followed by my PhD in biology at Carleton University in Ottawa, which I completed last summer before finally moving here to the territories of the Hamusquam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh in what is now known as Vancouver, BC, just last December. And then this January, I've stepped into this new position as an assistant professor of Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. And I'm the principal investigator for our new Center for Indigenous Fisheries, which I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about today. So again, my honor to be here along this amazing set of panelists who've provided really wonderful foundations for a lot of what I'm gonna share today. And I'm gonna start off by just diving a bit deeper into Indigenous research methodologies specifically. Sean Wilson, author of Research is Ceremony, asserts that an Indigenous research methodology means talking about relational accountability, as Sonia just introduced for us so well. As a researcher, you're answering to all your relations when you are doing research. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, author of Decolonizing Methodologies, is concerned not so much with the actual technique of selecting a method, but much more with the context in which research problems are conceptualized and designed, and with the implications of research for its participants and their communities. Employing Indigenous research methodologies for me has not so much changed the approaches by which I do science, although it certainly can, but really it's about the value system under which that method is applied. As put forward in decolonizing methodologies, the critical questions and concerns are: whose research is it? Who owns it? Whose interests does it serve? Who's going to benefit from it? Who's designed the questions and framed its scope? Who will carry it out? Who will write it up? How will results and benefits be shared? In Sheila Jasanoff's 2007 Nature paper on the technologies of humility, she asks us to think harder about how to reframe problems so that their ethical dimensions are brought to light. She recognizes huge value in the standard scientific approach and gives the example that climate scientists can tell us with high certainty that human activities are raising Earth's mean surface temperature, that extreme weather events will occur, and that melting ice caps will cause abrupt changes in the global climate. But she continues by clarifying how science cannot tell us where and when disaster will strike, how to allocate resources between prevention and mitigation, which activities to target first in reducing greenhouse gases, or whom to hold responsible for protecting the poor. She issues here a call for humility, especially for policy and decision makers to recognize the limits and the very real partiality of scientific knowledge, especially when faced with issues of extreme urgency and high uncertainty. In her view, policies and decisions based on humility might redress inequality before finding out how the poor are hurt by climate change, value greenhouse gases differently depending on the nature of the activities that give rise to them, and uncover the sources of vulnerability in fishing communities before installing expensive tsunami detection systems. While her call to action is not on the subject of Indigenous research methodologies really at all, her plea for us to re-engage with the moral foundations of science aligns extremely well in my view. A core concept for Indigenous research methodologies is that of the 4 R's, first described by Verna Kirkness and Ray Barnhart in 1991 as respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, which have been made apparent by all the previous panelists. Respect means valuing and building on the diverse knowledges of the individual, the culture, and community. Relevance means involving the community in all stages of the project to make sure the research is relevant to the needs and to the dreams of the community and culture. Reciprocity refers to when researcher and community both benefit from the project, and learning and research is a two-way process. This is positioned specifically to counter the multitude of one-sided projects that are aimed simply at achieving academic milestones, often ignoring the goals and concerns of Indigenous research partners. And I've seen comments to that exact effect in the chat. And finally, we have responsibility, which is an overarching principle and concept that pertains to the previous 3 R's, where the researcher is mindful of all perspectives and accountable to all partners in the research process. And this culminates in research that is pluralistic and holistic, where multiple knowledge systems are respected and considered valid, often brought together through interdisciplinary practices reflecting the interconnectedness of everything in our world. In research that is applied, addressing key localized and contextualized concerns, answering to specific identified problems, in research that is participatory and mutually beneficial, where gains from the research are shared among all partners, and that is steeped in this idea of relational accountability, of holding ourselves responsible to all our relations and all our partners in the research process. So my plan for the rest of my time here is to walk you through a few of my past, present, and future research, teaching, and outreach endeavors to share with you some of my preferred practices, to highlight some important missteps, which Stalo author and scholar Joanne Archibald cleverly calls "oh no" moments instead of aha moments, and speak to the ambitions and vision that I have for the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, which keeps me accountable and on a mission that serves all our relations, with a special interest in protecting the ever important interrelationships between fish, people, and place. So I'm going to start with my most recent and major set of research projects, and that's what I did for my PhD thesis entitled Fish, People, Place, Interweaving Knowledges to Elucidate Pacific Salmon Fate. And this used the life cycle of the salmon and the linked cycle of salmon-based knowledge systems as a conceptual framework that guided how I approached assessments on the state of our freshwater systems, the state of salmon systems and related knowledge systems, the effects of multiple stressors on salmon migrations, and the transformative power of Edo-Uptimuk, or two-eyed seeing, which is defined as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strength of dominant Western or mainstream knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. My dissertation was very interdisciplinary, bringing together fish biotelemetry, so tagging and tracking, interviews with knowledge keepers and elders, as well as a ton of synthesis and review. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but I'll just note that my work on the state of freshwater systems and my review of Edo-Uptimuk were both published open access, so I welcome you to check them out if you're curious. I also describe this latter chapter in full in a virtual seminar that I delivered last year to the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, which you can find on YouTube if you search Andrea Reid, Two-Eyed Seeing. And my other chapters are in various stages of the publication process, but I'll take this opportunity to plug a forthcoming special issue in Facets, centered on the intersections of biodiversity conservation and Indigenous health and well-being, where one of my remaining chapters will be homed. My thesis was centered on these ideas of being pluralistic, applied, participatory, and relational. I even wrote my 300 plus page thesis using the pronoun who for salmon in recognition of their very real role as relatives to live in reciprocity with, not simply resources to command and control like objects. My work was entirely based on relationships with the fish, with experts of all kinds, as well as with water and the various places that this work took me to. But it was not without its oh no moments. There were extreme complications that arose from fish crossing territorial boundaries, as inevitably anadromous salmon will. And this led to huge questions about who to work with, how and when. I quickly learned that open data, as Sonia alluded to, is not always the best policy when we're talking about culturally sensitive subjects like salmon, bringing us back around to those questions about who owns the data, has the right to control, access, and possess it. From all of this, I learned how much work needs to be done on the front end of a project to establish trust, to build relationships so that the work can be done in a good way. I learned how to not push a research agenda and to listen to those who are willing to share their knowledge and insights with me. I also learned how to navigate the diversity of community protocols that exist across diverse community contexts. Getting permission to work with knowledge keepers across 18 different communities in the province of British Columbia meant it could be as straightforward as just getting consent from interested elders in a community to participate, to requiring a presentation and proposal for review by chief and council or hereditary leadership before going to elders, to co-signing MOUs and laying out the specific terms of engagement in legalese before going ahead with the work. I also learned how so much work of this nature involves efforts beyond what makes it on the page at the end of a study. I was asked by my nation during my degree to run salmon science camps for Niisii youth, and this was a responsibility I really gladly took up. And with support from multiple UNSERC Indigenous Science Ambassador grants and the Gingolth Village Government's Education Department, I co-led, either with my spouse or another research colleague and friend, multi-day camps that get youth into parts of the territory they might not otherwise have access to, that involves visiting fish wheels to learn about the salmon monitoring program that Niisii Fish has been running in the Nass River since the early 90s, chartering boats to visit nearby inlets, to whale watch, to see salmon migrating inland, doing biotelemetry scavenger hunts where youth learn how to use receivers and antennas to detect radio transmitters that we've scattered throughout the village. And through this kind of play, they're learning to use the technology that's employed by Niisii Fish in the salmon monitoring program. We learn from and listen to elders, think about how language and story can inform our understanding and treatment of salmon. This was a profoundly transformative set of experiences for me. And this is one part of what inspired me to get involved in launching this charitable organization, Raiperia, with 2 friends and colleagues, an organization that connects female identifying and non-binary youth with learning opportunities on the water. We offer free week-long canoe camping trips, as well as day camps in Quebec for Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. And we work with the New Frontiers School Board, who has among the highest Indigenous representation across school boards in the city of Montreal. And through them, we've actually accredited our programming recently. So these youth can earn 2 extra high school credits, which is the equivalent of 1 course, from what we hope is a pretty remarkable experience for them. This is our team's way of giving back and being mentors to the next generation of water protectors, passing along the knowledge that we've been given through our university studies, through our time in community. And this gives youth a pretty rare opportunity, in our view, to learn directly from scientists, from knowledge keepers in tandem about how we can respect and protect water through our choices, actions, and responsibilities, both within and beyond the program. We have support from NSERC Promo Science to help carry this programming on into the future. And we recently received support from their Science Odyssey program to host a virtual seminar that took place yesterday afternoon, centered on speaking up for water, water protectors, storytelling, and science, involving Mohawk water polo Olympian and Oka crisis survivor, Winnie Corn Miller, cave diver and National Geographic explorer Jill Heinrich, as well as water walker, land defender, and grandmother to many, Doreen Bernard from Mi'kma'ki. And this is now available on YouTube if you'd like to go find it and listen into what they had to share. And what I've shared with you up to this point is really the culmination of work that's changed me as a researcher. I didn't go into this work with the understanding that I have now of how I can use the 4 R's and these related concepts from the outset to guide the direction and ambition of research. I more or less had to learn these for myself as I navigated my way through this work the best way I knew how. But now through this work, that's opened my eyes to the amazing scholarship being led by Indigenous scholars from around the world, many on this call, but others including Smith and Wilson and others that I've highlighted. And from my time in community, I recognize how the purposeful application of these concepts can create far richer experiences for all, and can help us avoid some of those oh no moments that are for sure great learning experiences for us as researchers, but perhaps ask a lot of our research partners and expose them to very real risks that we should do our utmost to minimize. So I'm going to pivot here from looking backwards to now looking ahead to the work that I'm undertaking with the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, using these concepts as guideposts. The 4 R's have been applied widely in social and health research, and I hope that I can help make clear alongside the other panelists that they're just as relevant to research in the natural sciences. The first project I'll share is situated here in the Lower Mainland, where I am now, where we're working with the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund, which includes 6 local nations, Katzie, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Musqueam, Tawasin, and Tsleil-Waututh. And this group was inspired by some work by the Maori called the Cultural Health Index, which is a way of assessing freshwater health that includes Maori knowledge and values. The Legacy Fund nations wanted to bring this framework here to contextualize it to their knowledge and values, and to co-create a freshwater health index that relies on more than just a Western lens. Perhaps some sites here in the Lower Fraser aren't unhealthy in the form of water contaminants or absence or low diversity of invertebrate or fish species, but perhaps they are unhealthy in that the community can no longer drink straight from the river, or that their access to culturally significant fisheries or the water itself has been reduced. And maybe it's both, or maybe it's neither, but we're surely going to understand a lot more about collective health by looking through both a biological and cultural lens. So we've been invited to work with them on this idea, and we've received support through MyTax and their Indigenous call to support our first 2 master's students in the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, Kate Mussett and Casey Sterling. We're now planning a series of workshops to collectively identify sites and indicators of significance. And then Kate and Casey will be implementing a field and community protocol that involves different kinds of sampling, such as water monitoring, as well as information gathering, such as interviews to elucidate changes in water quantity and quality concerns. And we aim in this work to really develop a guide that can also be of use to other nations and communities who want to apply the same kind of way of thinking in their contexts. Now taking a step out of BC for a moment and turning our focus to the Great Lakes of North America, where Indigenous peoples have also lived for tens of thousands of years. Here, with funding from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, we're initiating a project centered on sea lamprey and their control, in a project entitled Sea Lamprey Research and Management, Indigenous Input and Inclusion, or what we've nicknamed the 3I Project. And we like this name because it's evocative of the two-eyed seeing concept, but here we're focusing on more than just bringing together two ways of knowing, but really bringing in a third dimension, which is working together in a good way and defining collectively what this means for us in this context. The history of control methods for curbing the spread of sea lamprey, such as putting in barriers or applying really potent chemicals, lampricides, they've been really one-sided and without the full participation or consent of nations and tribes in the Great Lakes. So we endeavor to work with these communities to identify better pathways for working together on shared issues in the future and envisioning what more equitable governance in our fisheries management structures can look like. And I'll just note here that for this work, Alex Duncan from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation will be leading the way as he initiates his PhD with the center starting next fall. And the last research project that I'll touch on today is one entitled Fish Outlaws, which is funded by the National Geographic Society. And this is a collaboration grant that brings together myself as an Indigenous fisheries scientist, Amy Romer, a photographer and storyteller, Rena Priest, a writer from the Lummi tribe, and as of just a few weeks ago, she became Washington State's 6th poet laureate and their first Native American poet laureate, as well as Lauren Eckert, a conservation scientist who employs social methods. And together with support from a growing group of volunteers and students, we're working together to bring to the fore stories of how Indigenous fisheries in the Salish Sea have been criminalized, banned, usurped, or restricted out of existence. We're going to lead interviews with those that have lived experiences and wish to share their stories more broadly. And we're going to bring them together to envision again what Indigenous fisheries justice in these spaces in Canada and the United States can look like. We're going to build a timeline of relevant legal proceedings, collect, share, and visualize stories and experience. And from a research standpoint, begin to understand the context in which Indigenous fisheries have been targeted in these ways versus the contexts in which Indigenous fisheries sovereignty has been maintained and upheld. The 4 Rs are shaping all the decisions that we make as we initiate this work and make it respectful, relevant, reciprocal, and responsible to all those that we engage in the process. And I'll close this out by saying that at our center, we're committed to research, teaching, and outreach that places community needs and interests at the heart of all that we do, that implements reciprocity and Indigenous fishing ethics, like you see here, as methodologies. And I sincerely hope I've made that clear through what I've shared. Our work ultimately aims to support the management and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries in ways that uphold and respect Indigenous rights, values, practices, and knowledge systems. And we hope to become a hub nationally and eventually internationally for Indigenous fisheries work, learning, and knowledge sharing with our growing network of Indigenous organizations, fishers, managers, thinkers, artists, advocates, elders, youth, governments, communities. The list goes on and on. And so I'll just close by saying Tuyuk Sinisim, thank you all for your time and attention. And I'd like to just send out a special thanks to graphic illustrator Nicole Marie Burton, who created all of the comic style illustrations that I shared in this presentation today. And without her work and her contributions, I would not be able to communicate ideas as clearly. So Tuyuk, Nicole, and thank you again to the panelists who I'm really honored to stand here virtually beside.
Wonderful. Thank you all. There are people clapping in the background. That was so wonderful. So much to learn, so much to ask questions on. So we have a few questions. We have about 10 minutes or so to answer them. So again, if folks want to reach out to panelists, if panelists feel comfortable to share information, I saw Sonia had shared her email. But for the social and ecological data, do you need an IRB or internal review board approvals before interviewing or working on surveys? We prefer interviewing and surveying and have found the IRB process to be very colonial, for a lack of a better word. And that is posed to everyone.
I can start first. This is Sonia. For the work that I did go through an institutional review board process, which is what IRB stands for. And one of my challenges that I had is that I felt like the IRB process itself didn't protect community data enough, actually. And so I created a memorandum of understanding together with each tribe to make it very clear legally that all of this data belonged to them, because the IRB process requires a copy of all the transcriptions and recordings to just hand it over to our advisors as students when we leave the university. But this data does not belong to them. This belongs to communities. And so one of my goals in finishing the PhD and moving on is to work together with tribes to develop their own internal review process so that they can have the power and recognize that just because a researcher comes in and says they want to do a project doesn't mean that they can come in and do it.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to add that I defer to community protocol and process. And so some nations do have review processes in place for themselves. And so first and foremost, I prioritize those. And it depends on the nature of the project. And I found in this transition to UBC that our research ethics review board to be quite progressive in having a lot of these conversations and making space and deferring to what community needs first and foremost. So I think that there are some important changes that are occurring across many universities that hopefully are going to lead to better pathways ahead.
I would agree with that, Andrea, and also in Canada. So maybe the system up in Alaska is different as well. And the same with the Haida and Heiltsuk communities. So the Haida and Heiltsuk both have internal research protocol reviews, and we didn't conduct research without having them in place. So just as an example, as part of my PhD, wanted to do additional interviews in the Haida Nation, but because of various political circumstances, the process couldn't move forward, and so we just didn't do the interviews. And that is a reality that is part of the respect of working with communities, is that if it's not something that's appropriate at the time and place, then that may not be something that is what the researchers should be pursuing.
Thank you. Are there challenges with aligning or balancing the benefits for Indigenous communities from a governance and language perspective? That's another question.
Sorry, I'm just looking for the question.
Oh, I can post it up again. Are there challenges with aligning or balancing the benefits for Indigenous communities from a governance perspective, and language perspective was in there as well.
I think these are very complex issues that we're dealing with, and I would say yes, we're moving in a good direction, but we're not in the place necessarily where we found that equity that we're seeking. And so I would say that there probably will always be those, because there's always the need to really balance with each community what it is that is necessary. And Niisii is probably able to speak from within the community, but I think these are going to be ongoing challenges, and there won't be a one-size-fits-all answer, that it will depend on the relationships that everyone is building with the communities that they work with.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think I need to go further on that. But yeah, it's always going to be changing, and what communities need is always going to be changing, as does what does research need.
Yeah, I would just stress the importance of asking community partners what benefits are and not just assigning those from our positions as researchers. We don't know what benefits look like, and it's not necessarily authorship on a paper. If you aren't in the academic world, that's not really a benefit. And I think it really requires interrogating the purpose of the research and thinking about how it can broadly benefit many community members, not just in single individuals in a nation.
I just wanted to share a related idea to this question. When I first started my PhD, I was pretty blessed to meet Dr. Charles Menzies from the Kikatla Nation. And he gave a seminar once and he posed 3 questions that I printed in these giant letters on top of my desk that are still there. So it's been 8 years, a long time. And the 3 questions are, who is this research being done for? To really think critically about who is benefiting from this research, who's driving this research. The second question, why is this research being done? What's the rationale? What's the driving force? Is it a funding source? Is it the community that you are hoping to serve? And digging really deep in that question. And the third question is, does this research need to be done? And that one really hits home for me because there was my last field season. It was the last chance to collect clam data. This was my last chance of the PhD. Like, this is it. I'm, last chance. And there was a young person that was lost at sea. And in that moment, the most important thing wasn't to count and measure clams. It was to use the boat that I had, use the resources at my disposal, and try to bring this person home. And so that really helped me realize that that was the most important thing that as a researcher that I could do in that moment. And so I think those questions are ones that have helped me be accountable, and the answers to those questions evolve. And so that's why I've had them on my desk for a long time, is to just check in with myself and be honest with myself, as well as the communities I hope to serve.
Thank you for continuing to share those questions with us. I guess that follows with how has working alongside Indigenous communities and learning traditional knowledge enriched your lives and perspectives?
I guess I'll just jump in to say that, I mean, it's made the research process for me just far richer. And I get so much more personally out of leading a youth camp and thinking about how we can enrich those spaces than I do publishing a paper. And I find that, those benefits are also way more shared. But I think it also changes just the nature of how we do work. But we only have a couple minutes, so I want to let others chime in.
I'll chime in for a quick second. One of the very specific ways that I try to weave into my presentation and working in communities is connecting me closer to my ancestors. So my ancestors are from Mexico. I'm Cascan and Apache. And because of colonization of my peoples over 500 years ago, and growing up in the United States, I'm still in the process of connecting with my ancestors. And so spending the opportunity to spend time in community has allowed me to connect to my ancestors through weaving specifically. I come from a long lineage of weavers, and I didn't know that for a long time. And I didn't know that before I started the PhD. And so by spending time in Heidelberg and spending a lot of time with women, I learned how to weave and I learned how to process materials. And I went to go visit my grandmother for one last time before she passed to the other side. And I asked her about weaving, and she said, yeah, me and all my sisters, what's the big deal? Like, it was like a question that, of course, we're all weavers. And I learned about that by being on the other side of the world. And so it really awakened a lot of things within me that were just dormant, but they're still there. Thank you.
I can chime in for a quick minute too. And for me, I come from a very disconnected history because my parents came from Malaysia and Singapore, and their grandparents came from China to Malaysia and Singapore. And then they came to Canada. And so we were born in Winnipeg. And then I didn't live anywhere for any length of time. And my parents were not the kind of parents that shared a lot about the history of family and place. So I actually know very little about the history of my family because they, even though I ask them, because it's not something they're very open to talking about. So being here for over almost 30 years now has really given me a different sense of what taking care of a place is, being part of a place, and the people and the relationship that you have with a place and the people that live there has been a really big change in how I see our relationship with each other and with the world around us and the animals and plants around us.
All right, we have reached our hour and a half, and I just want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your work, your reflections, your oh no moments. I know I will be leaving this very inspired and humbled by the many ways of knowing and the power in it all. So thank you all for sharing, and thank you all for joining from all around the world. This has been a really beautiful experience.